The Southwest Missouri State University Department of Geography Geology presents Land and Life in the Ozarks. This course is one of several units of study offered in Ozark Regional Studies at SMSU and is designed to enhance appreciation of the cultural heritage of this region.
In this presentation, I'll be continuing with the discussion of agriculture in the Ozarks and talking about the various systems of farming that have been practiced and are being carried on today. You'll remember that in the last lecture I talked about the specialized crop farming, pioneer subsistence farms, the general farm, and fruit farms. I'd like to pick up at the turn of the century, essentially, taking these in somewhat in their chronological order, with the remaining types of farms. This was a time when there was a time of great readjustment in agriculture, not only in the Ozarks but in the United States as a whole. As farm mechanization began to take place, there was a searching about for different systems of farming. One of the systems of farming that was attempted in the Ozarks and prospered for a number of years was truck farming, in which they raised both tomatoes and strawberries. The growing of tomatoes for canning purposes was introduced around 1900, and the tomatoes could be grown on rough hillside farms. This was one of the factors that was important, and it consumed a lot of labor because virtually the whole family could be employed in caring for the tomatoes, and women and children could be employed in the canning factories, particularly young girls and the housewives. The canneries essentially fit into an economic niche, consuming surplus labor and also a time when there wasn't a great deal of competition in the market. If we could then look at the map, we see where this raising of tomatoes was important in the Ozarks, primarily in the Springfield Plain in Missouri and northwest Arkansas and northeastern Oklahoma. We find an area of concentration to the east of Springfield, another area of concentration to the west of Springfield, and a third area of concentration of tomato growing in northwestern Arkansas and eastern Oklahoma, around Fayetteville and Springdale. These were the major canning centers. If we can look at the first of the slides then, here we see a typical cannery, I guess. This one is taken in Christian County, and I counted as near as I could the number of people on the porch of that cannery, and I believe I came up with around 40 people. Now that's quite a number of people to be employed in the cannery. I'm not sure they all were employed there, but still a large number of people. If we can look at the next slide then, we see the interior of a canning factory in Billings, Missouri, that's also in Christian County. Most of the canneries were small. One early history reports that there were 100 canneries in the county. Now, that I'm sure is a little too many, but some of these were virtually household operations, and the produce from these canneries were taken to the larger towns such as Springdale and Springfield, and labels were put on the cans and then they were shipped out. Tomato farming began to decline during the 1930s, especially as droughts hit the area. Likewise, in the 40s, another factor was the difficulty of finding labor that would do stoop labor, as people could find jobs in the defense plants and in the cities. The quality of the tomatoes simply weren't competitive with some of the larger plants in other locations. So that by 1955, virtually all the canning plants had closed in Missouri, and most of the canning activity now is consolidated into large plants in Springdale, Arkansas, in the northwestern part of Arkansas, where some tomatoes are still grown. Another crop that was grown extensively was strawberries, and if we could look at the map of strawberries, we find that the distribution of strawberries in 1925, which was about the same time, each dot here represents 50 acres, incidentally, the same as for the tomatoes. we find that the main production area was again in southwest Missouri and northwestern Arkansas. The main period of production was essentially the same time span from around the turn of the century, perhaps a little earlier for the strawberries, in the late 1800s, until about 1930, and some production into 1940s. The main production area today is still in Arkansas. Virtually all the production has disappeared from Missouri. Some of the more important shipping towns during the heyday of the strawberry production in the Ozarks included Fayetteville and Springdale, Gravette, Arkansas, Exeter, Missouri, Purdy, Missouri, Monette, Pierce City, Neosho, Marionville, Logan, and of course Springfield. The decline of strawberry growing were essentially the same factors were responsible. That is, the drought during the 30s, the labor problems, and then competition from areas that simply were more specialized. If we can have the next slide, then we see a view of an early strawberry field in the Ozarks. Some of the fields were quite large, and they did use migratory labor that came in and harvested the crops in the months of May through June. In the next slide, we see a view of abandoned strawberry land as it looks today. You can tell this is a former strawberry field by the fact that the land is hilled and the strawberries were planted on these ridges. Actually, the very cherty soils that you see here were considered to be, to some extent, an advantage because it prevented the strawberries from rotting. Another system of farming that was used in the Ozarks was the cultivation of grapes, viticulture. Grape growing really continues to be of some importance in the Ozarks. The soil and climate are suitable, and it's actually experiencing a modest revitalization as a result of the general trend in taste toward wines as opposed to the more robust alcoholic beverages. Most of the recent increase in vineyards in the Ozarks has been in the old established growing areas. And if we can look at a map, I'll point out where some of these vineyards are located. In the orange, just to point this out, these are areas where deciduous fruit is grown. But the vineyards are primarily concentrated in and around, or in the vicinity of Herman, Missouri. Viticulture was introduced here quite early in the 1840s, and wineries were established at an early time. The Italian colony at Rosati, Missouri, on the border of Phelps and Crawford County, Italians established viticulture here around the turn of the century. Part of the Italian colony established itself at Springdale, Arkansas, and wineries and large groves or acreages of grapes were set out here. Wineries established in Springdale. Grape growing for just grape juice was important and continues to be important in Exeter, around Exeter and Cassville, and in McDonald County, Missouri. So another of these crops that was important for a period of time and has been revitalized to some extent. If we could look at the next slide, then we see a view of an early vineyard in the Ozarks. In the next slide, we see a vineyard that's currently in production. And in the next slide, a recent planting, a fairly large planting that was made near Koshkonong by the Bardenauer Winery Company of St. Louis. Another system of farming that was used in the Ozarks and is still important in the Ozarks is dairy farming. This came in around the turn of the century, although dairying had been important even before then, but commercial dairying especially began around the turn of the century. And the Springfield vicinity was the focus of this and still is. The counties, some 20 counties around Springfield in the Missouri part of the Ozarks, really makes up one of the largest dairy districts in the Midwest outside of the dairy belt in Wisconsin and the Lake states. By the turn of the century, good markets had been established in St. Louis and Kansas City and in the tri-state district. As larger land holdings were broken up, it was as the land holdings became smaller, it became necessary really to find a more intensive use of the land. And again, dairying was a way of using surplus labor. You could employ the whole family in a dairy operation as opposed to some other systems of farming. Missouri passed favorable dairy laws and created a dairy commission which helped in marketing of the products. And Springfield, of course, provided a local market, and it became the focus of dairying because dairying was very closely connected to the railroads, just as fruit growing was. And since the railroads tended to radiate from Springfield, Springfield became the hub of the manufacturing of dairy processing of dairy products. If we could look at the first of the slides on dairying, we see a typical Missouri dairy scene in the early 1900s. Today, of course, most of these breeds of dairy cattle are high-quality dairy cattle: Holstein, Guernsey, Brown Swiss. In the next slide, we see a picture of the Springfield Creamery Company in 1914. This was the first company to pick up cream from the farms. Prior to that time, it had been brought into the general store, and these wagons went out and picked up the cream cans and were brought into the store. The region always concentrated on production of dairy concentrates. In the early days, it was butter and ice cream. Today, it's dehydrated milk, milk concentrates, and especially American cheese. Today, of course, modern dairy operations really are to be competitive. Dairying has to be quite modern. If we could come in with the camera now and look at the number of dairy farms, and we can look at what's going on as far as dairy farming is concerned, we see that dairy farming increased very rapidly and continued to increase until about 1950, when in the 8-county area around Springfield there were nearly 8,000 dairy farms, and then since that time a very precipitous decline in the number of dairy farms. So today there's only about 4,000 dairy farms. Now this shouldn't be taken to mean that dairy farming is no longer important, because it is still an important part of the economy, because as the number of dairy farms has declined, the size of those dairy farms has increased. There has been some decrease in the number of dairy cattle, but the actual production has increased because of the increased production from each individual cow. Dairy producers these days have to use pipeline milkers, bulk tanks. The marketing is done through organizations such as Mid-America Dairy and Missouri Farmers Organization. Confinement feeding and record keeping, artificial insemination are pretty much standard practices. Another system of early farming was poultry farming. And poultry farming, of course, has declined pretty much. It was always, again, confined to the southwestern part of Missouri and northwestern Arkansas. For the most part, poultry farming is concentrated in northwestern Arkansas, where large turkey operations and broiler operations still continue to make headway. If you could come in and look at this chart, we see the trend of poultry farms. At one time, about 1930 in this case, there were over 1,500 poultry farms. Today there are just a handful, so that most of the poultry operations have retreated into Arkansas, so to speak. The most important, I suppose, system of farming in the Ozarks today is livestock farming, and it really is a system that is fairly well suited to the topography and to the soils and to the water resources of the region. After the bluestem grasses were plowed up, Kentucky bluegrass did become established, and of course the Ozarks has always been important as a livestock producing area. But since World War II, there's been a particularly marked shift to livestock farming. I think part of this is because prices have been a bit firmer than in the past, and more people can afford beef. Now, beef is terribly high right now, but still, compared to 30 years ago, it's cheaper in a relative sense as far as the purchasing power of the population is concerned. To show you just how important this trend toward beef operation has been in especially in the western Ozarks. A few statistics: the numbers of beef cattle in Missouri increased in the 1960s 75%. In the United States, the increase was 43% in that same time period. But in southwest Missouri and northwestern Arkansas, that increase was 136%. The number of beef cattle increased, more than doubled during that 10-year period. Next, if we could look at a few slides. If we could have the first slide then. We see here Hereford Cattle, and most of the breeds now or many of the breeds, they do use good bred-up livestock. Herefords here grazing on native grass in the Mark Twain Forest on some of the glade lands. Angus and Charolais are also grazed, and other more exotic breeds. In the next slide, we see that the landscape imprint of livestock farming is significant. Here, the forest has been cleared, bulldozed into piles, and then the land planted to fescue. Fescue grass has been had a tremendous impact on livestock farming in the Ozarks, or livestock ranching, really, because it does provide winter pasture, and it's easy, or relatively easy, to keep cattle over the winter with a minimum amount of feeding, and this gives the Ozark rancher a competitive advantage over places farther to the north. In the next slide, we see what this looks like from the air. Actually, this is a reversal. This removal of forest land is a reversal of a long-term trend in the eastern half of the United States for land to go back from agricultural uses into forest. And I think I picked this up back in the late 60s and some research I was doing in the southern Ozarks. But I read just recently that during the 10-year period, 1960 to 1970, there was an 8% decrease in forested acreage, and this is, I think, a fairly significant change. In the next slide, then, we see another way that forest land is cleared. They use aerial spraying, and literally thousands of acres in the southern Ozarks have been sprayed in recent years with herbicides to defoliate the trees, and then the grass, fescue, and lespedeza, and mixtures of grasses are flown in and sowed, and eventually this will provide a reasonably good pasture. If we could look at the next slide, then, we see that here an example of a valley that formerly was cultivated, and now it's gone back to grass. This is another landscape trend. In the next picture, then, if we look at this, we see actual statistics here of, looks like we are missing some of the statistics on the right-hand side. This is actual statistics for a farm showing the percentages of land in crops. What it shows is that the amount of cropland has decreased. There never was a terrible amount of cropland, but this is a farm in Reynolds County, Missouri, and the amount of cropland has decreased. The number of livestock, the varieties of livestock, the data I can read for you. There were 15 dairy cattle in 1936. There were some 30 sheep, 35 hogs, and a large flock of chickens. The only livestock on the farm today in 1970 is 75. That figure, I think, doesn't show on your screen. But it shows that there is a concentration and specialization of emphasis on livestock in this particular case, a transition from the general farm to the livestock farm. Then if we can look at the next slide, we see this actual farm in Logan Creek Valley in Reynolds County as it existed in 1936. You see the valley was planted in alfalfa, a small pasture, lespedeza, clover, corn, a mixture of wheat and clover and alfalfa. Now, and the slopes then were in bluegrass pasture. Today, I mapped this same farm, and in the next slide we look at this today, and we see that the fields are larger, and it's a somewhat simpler system with virtually all pasture and grass and no cultivated crops. Well, this is, I guess, a micro study of what's going on in the Ozarks in a very general way. The last type of farming I want to cover is what can be called part-time farming, and this, by and large, is the most important system of farming in the Ozarks these days in terms of numbers, because part-time farming is important and has been important. I think we ought to make a point here that part-time farming really is a system of long standing in the Ozarks, because really the hunter-woodsman who came to the Ozarks was really just a part-time farmer, and he farmed rather incidentally. And even during the era of general farming, the farmers made a good amount of money as hacking railroad ties or doing other types of work off the farm. If you look at this graph again for the 8 counties around Springfield, we see that the part-time farm, the trend for the part-time farm is here. There were about 1,500 part-time farms in 1930, and today there are some 7,500 part-time farms. So there is a strong trend toward part-time farming and finding some employment off the farm. Then I'd like to look next at another slide which shows data for the occupations of the male residents of Logan Creek Valley. This is in Reynolds County, and I think this is quite an interesting thing. We, a student and I, did a study of this valley, which had been done some years before, and we went back to the valley to see what people were doing there. And we found, just going down the list of the people who lived, the male heads of households in the valley, their occupations were mine employees 14, retired 13, part-time farmers 10, full-time farmers 6, employed in St. Louis 6, and this is the group of people that were long-distance commuters I mentioned earlier in connection with population. They commute all the way to St. Louis and commute back on weekends to live with their families. And sawmill employees 4. Well, looking at this sums up, the total is 53 people along 17 miles, 17 heads of household, or 17 males, along 17 miles of the valley. But when you look at that, you see that full-time farmers, there are only 6, so about 10% of the people in that valley make their living wholly from farming. A person just casually driving through the valley would see that all these people, a lot of occupied farmhouses, and you'd think it's fairly heavily settled. But in fact, very few people actually make their living from farming. And if you put part-time farmers and full-time farmers together, only about 1/3 of the population is really engaged in farming in any really meaningful way. To show you just how far this has gone, I suppose the best place to show you is in the vicinity of Springfield. And I have here a land ownership map for Greene County. And just looking at the map, I think you can see, looking at the whole thing, it looks like there's an awful lot of writing on it. And the names of all the landowners are written on this map. Now, if you can come in very close with the camera, this is north of Springfield, several miles north. You find that even out in these areas, the average farm tract is anywhere from 10 to 40 acres for the most part. And so there's a great deal of subdivision of property in an area close to Springfield. In the whole county, I went through trying to find how many plots of land were over 400 acres. And there are a few of these. If we can go back out with the camera, here's one here, here's some out here, another one over here. But all in all, only about 20 plots of land over 400 acres in the whole county. I think this shows how fast this subdivision of land has gone on as time is through the process of establishing part-time farms in the vicinity of the city. Now, to sort of finish up our discussion of agriculture in the Ozarks, I'd like to look briefly at another chart here, which shows the income from agriculture. This is taken from the census. And for the Ozark region as a whole, I simply tallied the data for all the counties and apportioned that part of the county that lies in the Ozarks to the Ozarks. We find that the total income from agricultural products was $735,627,000 in 1969, the last agricultural census. What I wanted to show here is that this is more than 90% of that really comes from the sale of livestock and poultry products, shown on this graph, $656 million. And that crops, hay, and nursery products account for only $79 million. I think this helps to put the whole picture into perspective. Certainly livestock raising is the most important source of income to farmers in the Ozark region. Now, I'd like to look at a couple of maps, and if we can go over to the maps of the value of farm products. We see here a map of the United States and the Ozark region here. What we find is that this shows the value of farm products per acre of land in farms, and for the average figure for the United States is about $32. In the Ozarks, we find some districts which have less than $9 income per acre. In the Courtois Hills, these tend to be the hill districts. In the Boston Mountains, some counties that have less than $9 per acre average income. In the interior counties, the average income per acre of land is $10 to $20 on an annual basis. And in the border counties, $20 to $40 an acre income. The highest values are in northwestern Arkansas, where truck farming is still of some importance. Washington County has the highest values of any county in the Ozarks. Then, if we can look at the size of farms, we find that the average size of farm in the United States in 1970 was 351 acres. In the Ozarks, the average size of farms, for the most part, are between 180 and 260 acres. That is, most of the areas shown in green. The smallest farms are in the southwestern part of the Ozarks, where the intensive systems of agriculture were practiced. That is, dairy farming is still of some importance, and to some extent truck farming, especially in the counties of northwestern Arkansas and adjacent parts of Oklahoma. Well, this then will conclude my presentation on the agriculture of the Ozarks. In the next presentation, I'll be talking about the lumbering industry and forestry as it's been practiced in the Ozarks over the past 100 years.
For course information concerning land and life in the Ozarks, contact Dr. Milton Rafferty, Department Head, Geography Geology, Southwest Missouri State University, Springfield, Missouri, 65802.